Hello everyone and welcome to this video on Stigma, and Beyond. Within this video I hope to outline the seminal contribution of Erwin Goffman and how social theorists have built upon and developed those theories. My aims and objectives are to outline some of the key contributions of Erwin Goffman towards our understanding of stigma, to analyse how theorists have developed Goffman's theories in the psychosocial tradition, to analyse how theorists have developed Goffman's theories in more of a sociological, structural tradition, and to evaluate the role of power in stigmatization. As usual, I've based my video on evidence which is taken from Solanke, Discrimination as Stigma, Goffman, Asylums, Goffman, Stigma, and further reading that I recommend, which is Rosenhan on Being Sane in Insane Places. I will give you those sources in full towards the end of the video. So, Erwin Goffman. Although the concept of stigma, meaning leaving or leaving a mark, has been around since ancient times, Canadian sociologist Erwin Goffman was the first to examine stigma from a social psychological perspective to theorize how stigma influences social interactions. And we can say that Erwin Goffman was from the symbolic interactionist perspective and tradition of sociology. Symbolic interactionism is concerned with how people make sense and give meaning to things in their social world. These meanings also include our identity and how we manage and present our identities to others. How do we manage our self and presentation of self in everyday interactions with others? As I say, I've drawn the ideas of this video from Goffman's seminal account of Asylums in 1961. Goffman developed ideas about how the individual becomes a social creature through the process of socialization. His work was based on observations. His first book, Asylums, from 1961, explored aspects of social life of those in a particular institution, the mental asylum. But you can, if you read Asylum, you can see how some of the points that he makes are transferable across to other, probably less insidious institutions, such as the school, or maybe the university, or the hospital, or other institutions within society. The same approach was taken, the same methodological approach of observation was taken in his 1963 book, Stigma. In Asylums, Goffman examines the effects on the self when people are confined to an institution such as prisons and mental hospitals. And this is why I recommend that you read the Rosenhan text on Being Sane in Insane Places, because it really gives us insight into how people interact and make sense of their experience within the institution of the mental hospital. Here people have to undergo a particular change in identity. Goffman calls this a mortification of the self. They are no longer the people they were before they entered into the institution. They are now something that has been defined by the institution. We can say this, in terms of, you might have remember in the film Shawshank Redemption, where there's a character called Brooks, the older guy, and because he's been in prison for so long, he's become institutionalized. His self is so wrapped up with the comings and goings and workings of the prison that when he's finally discharged from the prison after a very long time, he's unable to cope with modern society and unfortunately commits suicide. So for Goffman, an inmate, their lives are characterized by routine and lack of choice. They are not in control of their lives, and their lives are run in such a way as to minimize disruption to the institution. You can see similarities in the recommended viewing, which is One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, but you can also transfer this across maybe to more mundane practical experiences of working in maybe institutions like schools. How much control do the children have in schools? How much of their school life is governed by routines in which they have no say, and how much of those routines are designed to minimize disruption? So for example, how much have free time, breaks and lunch hours been reduced? The second key text is Erwin Goffman's Stigma from 1963. A stigma is something that can damage you socially. A stigma can be something that is physical, such as a child born with a cleft lip, or something about you which is not immediately obvious, such as the fact that you have had or have a mental illness. Goffman identifies the following types of stigma. Abominations of the body. And you've got to bear with us that Goffman's writing in the 1960s, so some of these word choices perhaps would not be appropriate in our contemporary description and analysis of. So abominations of the body, disability, deformity, etc. Secondly, blemishes of the character, such as a criminal conviction, a slanderous stir, or a mental illness, or a tribal stigmata. And this relates to something inherent in the individual, such as their religion, their race, and their ethnicity. Something that locates you or stigmatizes you as a member of a group. Goffman makes the distinction between discreditable and discredited stigma. Goffman considered individuals whose stigmatizing attributes are not immediately evident. In that case, the individual can encounter two distinct atmospheres. He is discreditable. His stigma has yet to be revealed, but may be revealed either intentionally by him or her, in which case he will have some control over how, or by some factor he cannot control. Of course, it also might be successfully concealed. Goffman called this passing. In this situation, the analysis of stigma is concerned only with the behaviours adopted by the stigmatized individual to manage his identity, the concealing and revealing of the information. So here we can think about mental health in terms of how much does the individual give away to strangers the fact that they may be suffering with difficulties such as depression or anxiety. How much does the individual reveal about themselves that they have anxiety or depression? But also, what sort of behaviours does the individual engage in to mask that they are dealing with anxiety and depression and other mental health conditions at a psychological level? In the second atmosphere, the stigma has been revealed in its entirety, if you like. The stigma has been revealed and thus not only affects the stigmatized individual's behaviour, but how other people interact with him and her. So Jones builds on Goffman's ideas. In Jones's analysis of stigma, they consider how much the stigma is concealable. So in the case of mental health, you might say that they're highly concealable. Of course, depending on the nature of the mental distress or illness will affect to what extent it is concealable. Secondly, what was the cause of the mark? Whether or not the stigma's prominence increases or decreases or remains consistent over time. So again, you can think of how people having a mental health relapse, the stigma's prominence is more noticeable than when a person's mental health condition is in remission. Thirdly, disruptiveness, the degree to which the stigma or other people's reactions to the stigma impedes social interactions. Fourthly, aesthetics, the subset of others' reactions to the stigma comprising reactions that are positive, approving, or negative, disapproving, but represent the estimations of qualities other than the stigmatized person's inherent worth or dignity. So here we're valuing or devaluing the stigma. How much, if you like, is it the person's fault? Fifthly, the origin, whether or not others think the stigma is present at birth, it's accidental, or it's deliberate. You know, is it the person's fault, or did they bring something about? For example, in the case of dual diagnosis, where a person has mental health issues and they may be self-medicating those with the use of drugs, are people saying or judging that person that they are bringing on the mental health issues through their use of drugs? It's the person's fault for using drugs, which is the reason why they have developed mental health issues. And sixthly, peril, the danger that others perceive, whether accurately or inaccurately, the stigma to pose to them. So we might say a paranoid schizophrenic is perceived to accurately or inaccurately pose a significant peril to people in the population versus a person who might be managing their obsessive compulsive disorder. I'm not saying that either of those perceptions are right or wrong, by the way. Goffman's work attracted a broad audience. A PsycInfo search of all articles published between 1963 and 2012 produced nearly 10,000 hits, with attention to social stigma growing significantly in the last decade. Development of the concept of stigma has taken two forms. Let's call one Route A and the other Route B. In Route A, Goffman's general theory of stigmatization was refined with the introduction of three specific triggers, and we'll look at those. And then Route B, the idea of structural stigma was developed to enhance our understanding of sociological aspects of stigma, in particular the role of power. So let's have a look at those in more detail. In Route A, which proposes there are three models of stigmatization. Goffman's general theory of stigmatization was refined by Katz in 1979 in an attempt to clarify the meaning of stigma as a social psychological concept. Katz proposes that three social psychological models to explain stigma taking place. Firstly, that the attribute is of sufficient cause. Secondly, the process of labelling individually. And thirdly, scapegoating. So the first one of those, attribute of sufficient cause. In the attribute as sufficient cause model, the possession of an attribute is enough to trigger stigmatization. Hostility and rejection occur because the attribute per se has a strongly negative social meaning. Under this model, a mere difference has the power to discredit. Stigma inheres in the attribute itself. However, as Goffman pointed out, this only holds true if the difference is visible, such as skin colour. The second model, according to Katz, is labelling. In the second model, labelling the attribute is a necessary but insufficient stimulus for stigmatization. The power of the attribute is dependent upon how the majority choose to view it. This choice depends on the contextual variables such as power and resources of the individual, the proximity between the normals and the deviants, as well as the visibility of the attribute. Under this model of stigmatization, context plays an important role in determining how normals react to the marked individual. And finally, the third model, according to Katz, is scapegoating. This model suggests that animosity precedes stigmatization. It is a hostility that drives the focus on defects in order to justify the hostility. Certain attributes are singled out. Under the scapegoat model of stigmatization, disparagement is an attempt on the part of the stigmatizer to reduce the moral discomfort they are feeling by lowering the worth of the victim. As Katz stressed, these models are not mutually exclusive and should be seen as guides to understanding the triggers of stigmatization processes rather than strict causal categories. So we can look at each process of stigmatization through each of these three lenses that Katz proposes. So let's look at the second route, Route B, if you like, on structural stigma, beyond the face-to-face. Although Goffman acknowledged the role of society in stigmatization, he did not explore the contextual aspects of stigma in depth. And this would be consistent with the social interactionist methodology and school and how we understand the social world. They're not looking to make generalizable conclusions, although that might be a moot point. His studies, for example, on asylums observed practices but did not consider their history or evolution, and thus his language of relationships referred to interpersonal interaction within the asylum alone. Goffman's ideas took their own trajectory and came to be seen as a dilution because it made the stigma something in the person rather than a designation or tag that others affix to the person. So although Goffman initially claims to be exploring the impact of relationships and the social interactions between people, he does focus his ultimate conclusions around what it means to be a stigmatized individual. This dilution had two consequences. First, it teetered towards presentation of an innocent view of stigma, i.e. something that happens naturally and it's almost sort of inbuilt into the human psychology or system. And secondly, that individualistic application identified people alone as transmitters of stigma. Mainstream stigma studies undertaken by cognitive social psychologists thus ignored an important aspect of stigma: its roots in social power. Critics including but not limited to critical social psychologists, took issue and sought to address this. They argued that these micro approaches, these social interactionist approaches, ignore the structural aspects of stigma, in the same way you might say that we've ignored institutional aspects of racism. Stigma or its roots in the conditions that exclude people from social and economic life. These critics challenged the sanitation of the concept by re-emphasizing the ostracization or social effects of the stigmatized. A person who acquires stigma loses their normal status and the social advantages that accompany normal status, while a person who loses stigma gains a normal status. And the implications of that is that people with normal status have more power, and people with stigmatized or abnormal status have reduced power and agency in society. So those who gain the stigma status lose social power and access to a range of basic resources such as healthcare, education and employment, while those that lose the social stigma gain social power. So, for example, inherent in this is a person with mental health issues who has enduring mental health issues might be shunned from educational opportunities and employment opportunities, but a person that loses that mental health issue or recovers from that mental health issue gains access to educational opportunities and employment opportunities, as the structural prejudices against them are no longer present. In 2001, psychologist Bruce Link and sociologist Joe Phelan set out to respond to the vaguely defined and individually focused stigma concept as used by social psychologists. They were especially concerned by the long-term policy consequences of this when combined with researchers lacking personal experience of living with stigma. In restoring the social perspective in studies of stigma, they had two main goals. Firstly, to clarify the concept, and I can't stress enough the importance to clarify terms that we're working with at the offset. If we don't know what we're talking about, all our future analysis will be somewhat faulty. Secondly, to construct a revised concept to improve its application, so it has purpose. This was born of the idea of structural stigma. Structural stigma creates a frame for a broader conception of stigma based on the relationships between a set of interrelated concepts that link psychological practices with social conditions. The result is a schema comprising 5 elements that trigger stigma when they converge. So what we're saying, very much like the Thompson idea of psychological, cultural and social effects permeating the individual and society, these 5 components are summarized next. People distinguish and label human differences. The dominant cultural beliefs label persons to undesirable characteristics and to negative stereotypes. Labeled persons are then placed in distinct categories so as to accomplish some degree of separation from us and them. Labeled persons then experience status loss and discrimination that leads to unequal outcomes. Finally, stigmatization is entirely contingent on those access to social, economic and political power that enables the identification of differentness and construction of stereotypes, the separation of labelled persons into distinct categories, and full execution of disapproval, rejection, exclusion, and discrimination. So this is the same idea as Thompson, more or less, in that saying the how stigma operates is holistically and totally through the individual, their psychological conception of self, how they interact in their culture, and then how they interact, gain, or are excluded from broader services in the social structure and society. While categorization may be used to facilitate cognitive efficiency, when does this mutate into cognitive laziness? And this is an interesting point, and you can look at me setting the groundwork for this idea in the other video on Introduction to Stigma. The third key component of stigmatization process is the use of negative stereotyping to create crude dichotomous categories: male-female, black-white, rich-poor. These us and them binaries facilitate justification to what may otherwise be irrational and questionable treatment of groups. Categorization suggests that a person is so different from us as to not really be human. This idea is the precursor to inhuman and degrading treatment. At its most extreme, binary thinking leads to embodiment, where the stigmatized person comes to epitomize a negative label. For example, a person with epilepsy becomes epileptic. Solanke's 2017 discussion on Lincoln Phelan. The key concept, if you like, underpinning all this is power. Lincoln Phelan are unequivocal on their role of power in stigma. Stigma is entirely dependent on social, economic and political power. It takes power to stigmatize. In some instances, the role of power is obvious. However, the role of power in stigma is frequently overlooked because in many instances, power differences are so taken for granted as to seem unproblematic. So finally, in this quite lengthy video, which I apologise for, I've tried to outline some of the key contributions of Goffman towards our understanding of stigma. I've then analysed how theories have developed Goffman's theory in the psychosocial tradition, and then I've analysed how theories have developed Goffman's tradition in a more sociological, structural tradition, away from individualistic accounts, to see how things operate on a macro and structural level. And I've tried to evaluate the role of structural power and the role that power plays in the stigmatizing process. Although the video has been long, I still don't feel I've done enough justice to the concepts herein as the original authors upon which I drew the research to undertake this video. If you'd like to explore that in more depth, here are the texts, and I alluded to the work of Rosenhan, but you can see how stigmatizing processes take place in Rosenhan's 1973 seminal study on being sane in insane places.